Welcome to The Rubber Meets the Road Economics, the podcast where we explore the driving forces behind today's economy and their real-world implications. Join investor Hunter Craig as he interviews Professor Edwin Burton from the University of Virginia, delving into the complexities of economics with clarity and insight. Whether you're an economics enthusiast or just curious about how economic policies affect your daily life, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
Professor, welcome. We're here November 6, 2024. A lot happened. Presidential election last night. The yield on the U.S. Treasury 1 month, 4.59%, 2 month, 4.6%. Yield on the 3 month, 4.55%. The Fed meets today and tomorrow to set the Fed funds target rate. What do you think they'll do tomorrow?
Well, there's no doubt what they'll do. Currently, their target range for the federal funds rate is 4.75 to 5, with T-bill yields well under that, almost a full quarter point under that. They'll bring the target range down to 4.5 to 4.75, and that'll put the T-bill yields right inside their target range. This is what they always do. It's completely predictable. They'll tell a story. Powell will say, well, we had a vote. Well, we had a meeting. Well, we had a discussion about this and that and the other. But the real truth is all you need to do is look at the T-bill yield. If that yield is sitting between 4.5 and 3/4, then that's where they're going. And that is where they're going tomorrow. You don't need to read the tea leaves. You don't need to think about 50 basis points. You don't need to think about zero. It's going to be 25 basis points. That's it.
So the Fed would lower tomorrow, and that will lower the prime rate that most banks charge by, if it's 25 basis points. Most banks, if not all banks, will fall in line for a 25 basis point reduction in their prime rate. However, the yield on the 10-year is 4.43% and rising. It was that high, a little higher this spring, but part of that hadn't been this high since 2007. Can you speak, Professor, please, to is the lowering of the Fed funds target rate in any way related to the yield on the 10-year? And the 10-year sets mortgage rates for many homes and many commercial mortgages.
Well, they are related most of the time. Most of the time, if your very short rates go up, your long rates are going up also at the same time. So generally speaking, you see mortgage rates going up at the same time. Federal funds rates are going up and down. But I would say a fair amount of time when conditions warrant, rates go in different directions. For example, now. Short-term rates have come down really quite a bit over the last 6 months, and 10-year rates and 30-year rates have gone up, and they've gone up dramatically just in the last 6 weeks. The 10-year yield was in the neighborhood of about 3.36 fairly recently, just 4 or 5 weeks ago, and now we're staring at almost 4.5. It's very close. I think it ticked at 4.5 earlier in the day. It's back off to about 4.4 something. So the longer-dated debt, if you want to borrow money for 5, 10 years or longer, those rates have gone up, and they've gone up pretty dramatically. Mortgage rates, good example. Mortgage rates had gotten down to the low 6s about 5 weeks ago. You're now staring at the low 7s. That's where the market is. Now, the market might not have fully adjusted at every single mortgage lender, but it will, and it'll be above 7, and it's not likely to go below that, not for quite some time.
Professor, why is the yield on the 10-year Treasury rising? Is that because they have to increase rates to attract buyers for when the U.S. government sells all this debt? We have a U.S. debt is $36 trillion. The U.S. government brings in roughly $5 trillion. And we have the largest debt in the United States peacetime, non-COVID, which is just shy of $2 trillion. Why are rates rising on the 10-year?
Well, no one knows for sure, but there'll be two things you would want to point to. One is what you just referenced, and that is the enormous U.S. sovereign debt. But you have to put also into that amount of debt the private debt and credit card debt and all the different other indebtedness that companies, individuals, and the government have in this country. You're looking at record levels of debt. That never ends well. We have way too much debt in the system, not just government debt. State and local governments are deeply in debt as well. Just look at every state government. They're all struggling. The city of Chicago, Illinois is constantly in the news. Their budgets are so completely unbalanced. They sometimes go month to month just paying the bills. So you have a lot of indebtedness in the system. People have spent an enormous amount of money at every level of government, and individuals have been doing the same thing. Savings rate in America is almost non-existent because everybody spends every nickel they can find. So that puts a lot of pressure on interest rates. And so we're seeing that. The economy is clipping along, inflation is coming down, but it's still bouncing above the Fed target. Inflation is still well above 2%. It's not anywhere near 2%. The last month's number was closer to 3% than 2%. And that's a big difference. That's 50% difference. So as long as you have these kind of debt levels, it's going to be very hard to see the kind of interest rates that we saw and were used to 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the sort of 3% mortgage rates and almost zero overnight lending rates for such a long time. You're not going to see that for quite a while. There's going to be a lot of upward pressure on rates. That's going to ultimately cause some real severe problems. It's causing some severe problems already in commercial real estate. It's certainly slowed up the housing market. You don't see very many home sales even still. You've had quite a period of very little home sales. So I think higher rates are here to stay. It could get worse. There's no relief in sight.
Professor, you've taught game theory at the University of Virginia for many years. At one point, you had several hundred people in your class. Do you have a good example of game theory and the option of choice?
Yeah, game theory is really helpful in practice, and I try to teach my students that. When you're often, imagine, let's take a simple example. You're thinking about buying a house, so you go look at the house. And most people think when you look at the house, you compare the neighbor's house and try to get a feel for the value of the house, and it's offered at some price. Game theory says, don't spend too much time on that. What you want to know, the first thing you want to know is, who's the seller? Why is he selling? Or he or she? What's the reason for the sale? Because you want to find out if the seller's anxious or not. Is the seller in a hurry, or does the seller not really care? That's going to really matter. You need to look through the other side of the market. Now, when we teach competitive economics without game theory, we say, oh, no, you don't look at all that. You just look at the product and the price. No. I teach my kids, you look through the product and price and start figuring out what happens with the seller. Now, you know in real estate that's key. Every good real estate guy knows that. You want to know why the seller's selling and why the buyer's buying. That's what game theory does. Game theory treats it like it's a game. Like you see the other side, you try to assess what their motives are. And sometimes when people tell you something, I can remember a lot of famous M&A cases that I was involved in when I was in Wall Street. You'd meet somebody and he was selling his business, right? And so you want to know, what does this guy want? And he tells you, what I really want is I want my employees to do well. As you know from experience that that's not what he wants. So you watch the guy and you see what his routine is, and you notice he's chauffeur-driven to work every day. He goes up to his big penthouse office every day, and he loves that. So you go back to him and you say, we're going to let you keep your car, your chauffeur, your penthouse. We're going to fire half your employees. And he says, done. Because you can't always believe what people say. You got to put yourself in their shoes and figure out what they're doing and ask yourself, okay, so what's going on? That's what game theory brings to the table. It looks at the motives of the people that you're dealing with, and it looks at your own motives, and they see you and you see them, and that's a game, just like any other game.
Can you speak to the 3-door option?
At the risk of driving the listener crazy, there's a very famous puzzle where there are 3 doors that you face, and behind one of the doors is $1 million. And you have the option to go up, open one of the doors, and if the $1 million is behind that door, you get it. That sounds pretty good. So you look at door A, door B, door C, and you decided, well, it's going to be behind door A. So you walk up to door A, and just as you're about to open it, somebody comes out and says, before you do that, I want to know, do you want to stay at that location or switch? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open one of the other doors and show you where it's not. So he opens up door C, and he says, see, it's not behind door C. So do you want to stay at door A or go to door B? So let me run through that again. Think about that. You go up to door A, put your hand on door A, and then somebody shows you that it's not behind one of the other doors. Let's say, for example, door C. And now you have the choice to stay at A or open B. Which is correct? And believe me, there is a correct answer here.
What are the odds if you open B versus A? Or switch to B versus A?
Do you switch or stay?
You switch and double your odds.
That's correct. And the best way to think about that is when you walk up to the 3 doors in the first place, what are your odds of getting $1 million? 1/3. If you never switch, those odds don't change. So you have a 1/3 chance of winning it. So suppose you just do it every single day. And your best friend, he goes with you and he says, okay, you can stay at A, I'll take the other 2. You win 1/3 of the time. He wins 2/3 of the time. So the odds if you switch are 2/3, twice as good as 1. And that's a pretty tough one to see why that's the case. But often students come to me and they say, no, it's got to be 50-50. It has to be 50-50. It's very similar if you're a bridge player to what's known as the principle of restricted choice. It's a very similar situation. But it's best to switch in that case because you glean information. The information is not useless. And if you're really going to take advantage of the information that door C is open, you got to switch.
Professor, thank you. A lot happening tomorrow. November 7th, the Fed makes a decision on the target Fed funds rate. You're predicting absolutely 25 basis point reduction.
There's no question, Hunter. It will be a 25 basis point reduction. And don't worry about all the conversation they say, well, we had a tight vote. It was 8 votes in favor, 1 vote against. Forget about all the voting. They will cut by 25 basis points. And it's interesting, Hunter, because if you think about it, suppose you're an undergraduate taking macro, and I give you the following question. Imagine that you're in an economy that's growing at 3%, well above trend, that the stock market is trading at an all-time high, and unemployment is staggeringly low. Is this a time for Fed easing? Imagine answering that question on an exam.
Professor, are you saying all the macro we all took was a waste of time?
Well, when I took macro, they taught me that Fed eases when the economy is in terrible shape, and they tighten when the economy is very strong. Now, we have a very strong economy, and we have super stock market at an all-time high, and it's been doing great for the last 8 or 10 years. And unemployment's 4%, which historically is really, really low. So why are they cutting rates? Well, they're not cutting rates for all the reasons they tell you. They're cutting rates because T-bill yields are sitting at between 4.5 and 4.60. That's why they're cutting the rates, and they will definitely cut them tomorrow.
Professor, thank you. You're the best of the best. Tomorrow's a big day.
Thank you, Hunter. Enjoyed being here.
Thank you for joining us for the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast. If you enjoyed the discussion, remember to subscribe and stay updated with future episodes. Join us soon for more conversations about modern economics on the Rubber Meets the Road Economics podcast.